In this video, we'll be looking at how to incorporate a Bootstrap 5 modal into our React application. So stick around and I'll show you how to do it. Hey guys, how's it going and welcome to the channel. If you like the content of this video, please give it a like, share and add a comment in the comments below and hit that subscribe button and bell icon. Now back to the video. So let's take a look at the application we're going to be building. As you can see, we've got two buttons here in the top right hand corner of our browser window. The first one is for terms and conditions and the second one is to log in. So if we click the terms and conditions, a modal appears and then we can accept the terms and conditions and we can click confirm. If we click the terms and conditions again, it's all reset and we can't confirm until we've actually accepted the terms and conditions. We can still cancel, but we can't confirm. And we can close the modal by either clicking the cancel button or the X at the top of the modal. The second button is the login button, and if we click that, we're presented with a modal that gives us the option to key in our email address and our password. Now this isn't a working login. This is not going to send you off to a database anywhere so that you can log into the site. It's just for demonstration purposes. So we haven't actually got an email address or a password that will log us into the application. So we can key anything in here and then that allows us to hit the login button. Once we've hit the login button, the button here changes to log out. And if we hit that, it asks us to confirm that we want to log out, and then we can click the log out button to log out. We can also close this modal by hitting the cancel or the X or clicking away. And that's it. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is create our new React application, and we can do that by typing npx create React app and then the name of our application, which I'm going to call React Bootstrap 5 Modal, and then hit enter. Now that'll take a few minutes to install, so I'll pause the video there. Okay, so that's all installed and we can now cd into our new application. So cd React Bootstrap 5 modal, and then we can type code dot to bring up our VS Code editor, and as you can see, VS Code's open and we're in our new application folder, React Bootstrap 5 modal. We can then open up our integrated terminal and type npm start and head on over to a browser window where we can see our initial application is up and running on localhost 3000. Okay, so back in VS Code, the next thing that we need to do is just to close this get started window, but we also need to remove some of the files that were installed when we ran the command create React app, because we're just not going to need them in this application. So we can get rid of our app CSS, we can get rid of our app test, index CSS, logo SVG, report web vitals.js, and set up test.js, and we can just delete those. Then what we need to do is we need to go into our app.js file and we need to remove the references to those files that we've just deleted. So we need to get rid of those lines. We need to get rid of all of this. And we can just give this a h1 tag and the name of our application, which is React Bootstrap 5 modal. We can get rid of that line as well. And then if we go into our index.js file, this is where we need to remove this line, this line, this line, and we can also get rid of these comments. And then if we jump back to our browser, we can see we've got our h1 tag with the name of our application. And the next thing we need to do is install Bootstrap, so we'll do that now. So back in VS Code, if we open up another terminal window, we can type the command npm I bootstrap and that'll install all the Bootstrap packages for us. And we can just check that by going into our package JSON file, and we can see that Bootstrap 5.2 has been installed. So Bootstrap's been installed, but now what we need to do is import it into our application. And I'm just going to paste in this line, which will do that. So if we head back to our browser window, we can now see that the Bootstrap styling is now being applied to this H1 tag. So the next thing we need to do is create our components. And to do that, we're going to go into the SRC folder. I'm going to click the file icon. And our first component is going to be called app modal. The next one is going to be our authentication. And our final one is going to be terms and conditions. And for each one of these, we'll use our RAFCE snippet to create some basic JSX. And what we're going to do now is just import our authentication and terms and conditions components into our app component. So we can get rid of this now, and we can create a fragment, and then we can import terms and conditions, and then import our authentication components. And if we jump back to our browser, we can see that they've been imported now. And we can just apply some styling to this. So we'll give it a main tag and a class name which equals container. We'll add Bootstrap's flexbox, and then we'll justify content and save that, and jump back into our browser, and we can see that it's moved these two components over to the right hand side. So the next thing we want to do is to start building our app modal component. And so what we need to do is head over to Bootstrap's website, and we're in docs, and we go down to components, and we click modal, and then I want this live demo one. So if I take a copy of that and then head back to VS Code, and I'm just going to paste that in where this div component was. And we need to get rid of these comments. And we also need to wrap this in a fragment. And we can save that. Now what we can do is bring the app modal component into our other two components. So if we go into authentication, we can get rid of this now. And we can just go app modal, bring that in there. And the same for terms and conditions. Save both of those. And then if we head back to our application, we can now see that we've got the app modal component rendering in our terms and conditions component and also our authentication component. If we go to our dev tools, so I can press F12 and look in the console, we've got these two warnings. where it's saying we need to replace the occurrences of the word class with the word class name. And this one is also saying that we need to replace tab index with a lowercase I to tab index with an uppercase I. So let's fix that now. We'll head back to VS Code and go into our app modal component, and we can look for the word class, and we can just do a Control F, and we can replace that with class name, and we want to just replace all. So that's that one. And then we look for the tab index, which is this one here. And we just need to change that to an uppercase I. And that's just the way that React works. So if we now go back to our browser and we refresh the page, those warnings have now gone. Now what we can see is that these modals have just got hard-coded text. So what we really need to do is to bring that text in as a prop. So let's have a look at that. Back to VS Code. And we can see here where the hard-coded text is. So what we want to do is we actually want to bring that in as a prop, and we're going to call it title. And then we're going to display that prop here. So app modal is taking in a prop called title. So that's got to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from our parent components. So here we're going to go title. And this is going to be login. And in the terms and conditions one, we're going to say title equals TNCs. So if we go back to our browser now, and we can see that it's passed that title prop incorrectly. Now what we'll notice is that when we click on one of these modals, actually nothing's happening. And that's because it relies on Bootstrap JavaScript to open and close these modals. So let's go back to VS Code and we go into our index file. We can see that we've imported Bootstrap CSS, but we've not imported Bootstrap JavaScript. So I'll just paste in that import. And now let's jump back to our browser window and see what that's done. So we can now see that the modal's working. But if we take a look at Bootstrap's documentation and we go down to JavaScript, it tells us here that in React we can use the Bootstrap CSS, but the Bootstrap JavaScript is not fully compatible. And there is a risk of introducing bugs into our application. So we don't want to do that. Now it is suggesting that we could use another framework, something like React Bootstrap, but I don't want to do that. I want to stick with the vanilla Bootstrap. So we've got to work out a way of getting our modal to work without introducing the Bootstrap JavaScript. But first we need to understand what it's actually doing. So if we have a look at our application and we go to elements, we just open this div and then this main container, and then we can have a look at the modal, just one of the modals. Just open all these up. And then let's see what happens when I click it. So what it's doing is it's changing some classes. So one solution would be to create some logic to say that when this button is clicked, we can add these classes and change this styling. But there is a better solution, and it's using useRefs. And I'll show you how to do that now. So back in VS Code, we can remove this import now because we're not going to need that. And we can close the index.js file. And we can go back into our app modal file. And what we need to do is we need to bring in some state management. So I'm going to bring in useState. I bring in useEffect. And I'm going to bring in useRef. We're also going to want to import the modal component from Bootstrap. Then we can use our useState snippet can say modal, set modal. I'm going to set that to null initially. And then we want to go const example modal equals useRef. And then we need to change this ID, because we're not going to be using ID. We want to actually use ref. So you can see that this is now the ref that it's referring to, which is the component that it's referring to. But we need to change this example modal to not be hard coded. We need to make sure that it's taking it from the useRef. Like so. And we also need to ensure that this modal piece of state is set to the modal when the app component renders. And to do that, we need to use useEffect. So we can use the snippet. We can get rid of this. And how we do this is we go set modal, and then we want new modal. So that's referring to this modal that we brought in from Bootstrap. We want to give it the ref, which is example modal, and then the dot current. We can get rid of that. And dot current is the only property that you get from a useRef. So now that that's all tied up, we can actually add this modal with the methods show or hide to an onClick handler. So let's put one on this button. That's going to be an arrow function, and it's going to be modal.show, because that's what we want it to do. This is the button with the title on in our application. So this is the T&Cs button or the login button, and when we click that button, we want to show the modal. We can now get rid of these data attributes, otherwise we'll start getting errors. So before we do any more, let's just jump back into our application and make sure that this modal show is now working. So if we click on our modal button, we can see that it's now working. Which is great. And if we click on our elements, we can see that it's doing exactly the same thing. But now what's happening is that React is actually doing this through the use of useRefs, and it's not happening through Bootstrap JavaScript. So there's a couple of other things I want to change. One is when we click on it, we're getting this hard-coded modal title, and we really want it to be the actual title. And I also want to get rid of this fade in, fade out of the modal. I just want it to appear and disappear. And I also want to just separate these buttons slightly. So let's fix those few things. Back into VS Code, and we can add a margin of 1 around our buttons. And we can remove this fade property from the modal. And we can also change this to use the prop. So in our application, we can now see that that's bringing in the prop. There's the margin around the buttons, and we can also see that the modal is appearing and disappearing without the fade. So that's all good. But as it stands, we don't have any body content in our modal. We've got our header, we've got our title, and we've got our buttons, but we don't have any body content. So what we're going to do there is we're going to go to our parent components and create another prop, which we can pass in to the app modal. And we'll do that next. So if we go back to Bootstrap's website, and then we look for forms, and then we go checks and radios, come down here, and then I'm just going to grab this first div, copy that, and then back in VS Code, I want to go into terms and conditions, and I want to create a variable called modal content. And the first thing I want to add is a paragraph tag, some lorem ipsum. I'll just wrap that. And then the second thing is the checkbox that we've just copied from Bootstrap. Now it flags these errors on input because it needs a closure. And also we need to change class to class name. And we want to change this default text to accept terms and conditions. Now what we want to do is we need to bring this in as another prop. So we can say content, modal content. So now we need to jump back into app modal, and we need to bring that content in as a prop. That's content. And then if we scroll down, we can see modal body. And that's where we want to render our content. So back to the application. And if we click on our terms and conditions button, we've now got the content, which includes this clickable checkbox. Okay, so now what we need to do is create the body for the authentication modal. So if we go back to Bootstrap's website, and in forms and just in the overview, we want to grab this first form here. So if we copy that and then go back to VS Code and go into our authentication component and create a variable const modal content and paste that in. And then again, we need to correct these inputs. So we can select all of these using our Alt key. And if we go to the end, and that's closed all those off. We need to replace class with class name. So we select all of those. We need to pass in that content as a prop. So content equals modal content. Just save that. And then we don't need this submit button. And we don't need this checkbox. So we can remove those, and then we can save that. And then we can jump back to our application. And we click login now. We've now got our form fields in our authentication modal. So what I want to do now is change the text on these buttons. So if we jump back into VS Code and we start off in the authentication component, I want to create a couple of props. So one's going to be called cancel button text. And that's going to be cancel. And then I also want confirm button text, which is going to be login. So if we copy that, and then we do the same in terms and conditions, if we paste that in here, and then just change the login text to say confirm, and then what we need to do is then bring those props into our app modal component. So we go to the top, So we can go cancel button text and confirm button text. And then they'll display down here. So this is our cancel button text. And this is our confirm button text. So let's take a look at that. And we can now see that it's bringing in these props. So cancel, confirm, and login and cancel. So the next thing we want to look at is in the terms and conditions modal, we want to get this accept terms and conditions working. So if I cancel, I want that to reset to unchecked when I reopen the modal. So you can see if I check it now and then I cancel, I want this to reset itself. And I also want the modal to close when you click the confirm button, which it's not doing at the minute. So we'll take a look at that next. So let's head back into VS Code and in our terms and conditions component, and we want to bring in some state management. So if we import useState and then create some state using our snippet, and we're going to call this is checked, and this is referring to the checkbox, and its initial state is false. So then what we can do is we can come down to our checkbox component and we can do an onChange event. So on change, and we can give this an arrow function and we'll say set is checked, previous is checked, is the opposite. So what we're saying here is that when we check the checkbox, we have an onChange handler, and that changes the state value is checked from whatever was the previous value to the opposite of that. So if it was false initially, it becomes true, and then if it's true, it becomes false. And then checked, which determines whether it's checked or not. So we can now set that to the value that's in the is checked piece of state. Now we also need a way of resetting this piece of state back to false when we're in the app modal component. And the way we can do that is by creating a callback function. So we go const reset inputs. That's going to equal an arrow function. And we're going to set is checked to false. And then we can pass that in as another prop. And then if we go into our app modal component, we can bring that in. We can remove these lines, which are how Bootstrap is currently closing the modal, because we want React to be able to do that. So we can get rid of this one, and we can get rid of this one. So we can now create an event handler, which when the button is clicked will reset the inputs. So we're going to call this handle cancel on click. Doesn't take any parameters. but what it will do is it will reset the inputs. And because we're now using an event handler on the cancel button, we can also use the modal.hide function to close the modal. So if we find our cancel button, we can now get rid of this data attribute, which is how Bootstrap is currently closing the modal. So we can delete that, and then we can create an on-click handler. And we can use the handle cancel on click function. So we're now saying that when we click the cancel button, it fires the handle cancel on click, which closes the modal and also resets the inputs. So the checkbox should now be unchecked. So let's jump back into our application and we refresh and we hit the terms and conditions. And now if we click the accept terms and conditions and we press cancel, what we're expecting to see when we reopen the modal is that the accept terms and conditions checkbox is unchecked. So if we cancel, and we fire it back up again, it's now unchecked. So that's working. Now what we also want to do is we also want to make sure that when we hit this cancel button, it does the same, which it's not doing at the minute. It's not unchecking the checkbox when we cancel. And we also want to make sure that it does it when we hit the confirm button, but we need the modal to also close when we hit the confirm button. So we'll do that now. Back in VS Code. And where we've got the modal close button in the top right hand corner, which is this one here, we want to also add the on click handler. So copy that, and then we can get rid of again the way that Bootstrap is currently closing the modal. We paste that in, and then we want to look at how to close the modal when we hit the confirm button. So we're going to create another function for that. And I'm just going to make a copy of this one, and we'll just rename this to confirm. And then we can add that now as an on-click handler on the confirm button. So this wants to be handle confirm. Now one thing you probably noticed is that these are duplicates. They're doing exactly the same thing, but we do need to add some extra functionality when we come to the authentication modal. So I'm going to keep them as they are. So if we go back to our application and we click our terms and conditions modal, and we check the accept terms and conditions, and then we use the close button to close the modal, reopen the modal, it's now reset the accept terms and conditions checkbox. And if we click it again, and then we hit confirm and open the modal, it's also working correctly. So one other thing that I want to do is I want to actually disable this button until the user accepts the terms and conditions. So when we click this, it will enable the confirm button. And if we uncheck it, it will disable the confirm button. So in effect, they can only actually submit this once they've accepted the terms and conditions. So let's look at that. Back in our terms and conditions component, we're going to add another prop, which is going to be called confirm button status. And what we're going to say here is we're going to say if is checked is true, then null, else set it to disabled. So that's saying if the checkbox isn't checked, set this confirm button status to disabled if the checkbox isn't checked. And we now need to pass that prop into the app modal component. If we go to the top, bring that in. We can come down to our confirm button and we can add the attribute disabled, and that is equal to confirm button status. So let's have a look at that in our application. So if we open our terms and conditions modal, we can now see that the confirm button is disabled. And if we check the accept terms and conditions checkbox, it now becomes enabled. So disabled, enabled. So that's working. And the last thing I want to do in the terms and conditions component is just change this for attribute to HTML4, which is what React uses. So that's it for the terms and conditions component, and we'll now look at the authentication component. So if we open up our login modal, how we want this to work is that if the user hasn't entered anything into the email address or the password, then the login button should be disabled. Only when the user has entered both should the login button be enabled. And then what we also want to happen is that when the login button is clicked, it changes this button here to say log out, and then we'll have another modal to appear. So let's take a look at that. So back in VS Code and in our authentication component, what we need to do is we need to bring in some state management. So we're going to say use state, and we're going to use our use state snippet. I'm going to have a piece of state called form data. And that's going to be set to an object with an email, which is set to an empty string, and then a password, which is also set to an empty string. And then we want to be able to update this form data when a user types into the input fields. So we can do that using an onChange handler. We also need to change these 4 attributes to HTML4, like we did in the terms and conditions component. So if we add an onChange handler, and we're going to set that to handle on change, and we'll do the same for the password, handle on change, and then we can create that function. And that's going to take in the event. And then what we can do is we can set form data to whatever the form data was before. So we use the spread syntax there. And then we want to capture the event.target.name. And we populate that with the event.target.value. So on each of the inputs now, we need to add a name and a value attribute. So we go here and we can say name equals email, and the value is equal to form data dot email. Copy that. And on password, we can do the same. Change this to password. So when we type into our fields now, it should store the values into the form data state. So to see that in action, if we just console log our form data and then head back to our application, and then if we inspect and look at our console, and then we click on the login, and then we start typing, we can see that it's gathering, it's collecting this data, which is our form data. we want to have a way of saying that if any of these fields, if the password or the email are just empty strings, then we need to disable this login button. So back to VS Code, and we're going to add another piece of state. So using our useState snippet again, and we're going to say is user logged in. And to start with, it's going to be false. So we can use this piece of state now to set the status of the confirm button. So down here, we can say confirm button status. So if the user's logged in, then null, else set the button to disabled. What we need now is a mechanism to change this value so that the user can be either logged in or not logged in. So we'll create a function called login user. Doesn't take any parameters. And we just want to go set is user logged in. And we can do a similar thing to what we did in the terms and conditions component, where we say the previous is user logged in. Copy that. Is set to the opposite of that. And then we can pass that function in as a prop to our app modal component. So login user and then if we go into our app modal component, we need to bring that in. And then this is why I created two separate functions here for the buttons. So only if this is an actual prop that comes in, because it doesn't come into our terms and conditions one. Now there are other ways to do this. We can do prop check-in using prop types or TypeScript, but I don't want to do that in this tutorial. So we just need to put a conditional around this. So if we say if login user, then call login user. And I'll just go over that again because it does look a little bit odd. We're bringing in a prop of login user, but only our authentication component is actually sending that prop in. If we look at our terms and conditions, we're not actually sending a login user in, but in this one we are. So we need to say in the app, we need to check for that. Is it being sent in? And if it is, then we need to run it. And if it isn't, it doesn't. So like I say, we could use prop types or TypeScript to make this an optional prop, but we've not been using that. So in this tutorial, I want to keep it relatively simple. But what we need to do now is we still need to enable that button when the form has been completed, and it's not doing that at the minute. So if we go back into our authentication, we can create another function, and we're going to call this validate form. And again, it's not going to take any parameters. And we're going to destructure here. So I want to say const, and I want to grab the email and the password from form data. So if they've got values in them, I want them to be returned. If they're true. So if they've got values in them, they're not just empty strings, then it's going to return that as a true value. And then we can use that then down in our prop and we can say validate form or is user logged in. So this is saying if the form is empty or the user isn't logged in, then disable the button, else enable it. So if we take a look at that in our application and we hit the login button, we can see that it's disabled, but when we key in both fields, it becomes enabled. If I was to delete that one, it's disabled. Delete that one, it's disabled. But if both are filled in, then it becomes enabled. So what we want to do now is that when we're allowed to log in, i.e. the form's complete, we can log in. We want this button then to change to say log out. And we also want to reset these fields. And when we click on the log out button, it should present us with a modal that has different content and also a different title. So let's do that. So we'll look at the title first. What we need to say here is we need to wrap this in curly braces, and we need to say is user logged in, and if they are, we want it to say log out, else we want it to say log in. And we can copy that and do the same for the confirm button text. And then we need to add the content for when the log out modal is shown. So we can put a conditional here which says is user logged in, then display the form, else and this should actually be if the user isn't logged in. So if the user isn't logged in, show the form, else it assumes that the user is logged in and therefore gives them the option to log out. So the last thing we need to do in this component is to create another function to reset the inputs. And we want to set form data and we're resetting them to their original values, and we also need to pass that in as a prop to our app modal component. So if we say reset inputs equals reset inputs, and we save that, and we can also remove this console log, save that, and then if we go back to our application and we refresh, and now if we click the login button, we're presented with the form and our login button's disabled. But if we complete the form, our login button is enabled, and then if we click the login button, it changes the login button up here to a log out button, and then we click log out button, the title of the modal changes to log out, and we get this confirmation message, are you sure you want to log out? So if we cancel that, we're still in the status of being logged in, but if we hit the log out button, it changes our status to logged out, and therefore we can log in again. So we've got two modals now, our terms and conditions one and our authentication modal. And that's it. So we've now got our two components, our terms and conditions component and our authentication component, both using the app modal component, which uses the Bootstrap modal component, all working in our application. Hope you've enjoyed the video and you can take something from it, and don't forget, if you like the content of this video, please give it a like, share and add a comment in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button and bell icon. And I'll see you in the next one.